From possibly ruining his legacy by losing to a YouTuber to making big bucks that'll last him a lifetime. Here's why Nate Diaz needs to retire if he loses to Jake Paul. The days are passing by, and it's almost time for Diaz and Paul to lock horns in the ring. There's so much that can go wrong for either fighter, but I hope Diaz knows his whole future in the fight world is at stake here. There's no denying that Nate is one of the best fighters the UFC has ever seen, and he had his sweet time in the glitz and glam of the fight world. After all, he was the first fighter to take down Conor McGregor in the octagon, and he slammed the brakes on the Irishman's hype train. But this athlete's castle is crumbling down, and his loss to Paul is going to set it in stone. Get this, if the Stockton native loses to the YouTuber, it's going to be his third loss in his last 4 fights. Diaz's last few days in the UFC weren't his best. Nate wasn't in his best form when he lost to Jorge Masvidal at UFC 244, and that third-round knockout stayed with him. His next bout with Leon Edwards wasn't one for the books either, and his career definitely took a hit after that one. The athlete was able to come out on top in his last fight at UFC 279 with Tony Ferguson. Yeah, I'm sure you remember that one. Hear me out with all these humiliating losses. Diaz has already lost the power he once had to his name, and fighters in the UFC aren't seeking to fight him anymore. Now you can only imagine how bad things are going to get if he loses to a former Disney star with little to no experience in the fighting world. Paul isn't a pro, and apart from a little wrestling experience in high school, he's got no history in combat sports. He just got into the boxing game in 2020, and this guy's only stepped into the ring about 7 times. Plus, he's only proven himself to old and retired MMA stars. Yeah, let's not forget that Paul lost to the first pro boxer he put gloves against. So it's safe to say, the content creator is far from a professional. Now compare this all with Diaz's experience in combat sports. The Stockton native made his UFC debut in 2004, and he's been fighting ever since. That's decades of experience right there. Just imagine how bad the headlines are going to look for the former UFC star if he loses to Paul. Pro MMA star loses to a YouTuber, or Disney star takes down a pro MMA fighter in a humiliating fashion. Yeah, it's bad. Now I'm sure you're probably wondering, if Paul's unprofessional and inexperienced, why are we even worried that he's going to take Nate down in the ring? Well, remember when I said the MMA star had lost his mojo? That's one reason why, and let's not forget that Paul has an excellent track record of taking retired MMA fighters like Diaz down. He's knocked out Ben Askren, Tyron Woodley, and has even come out on top against the GOAT Anderson Silva. But mind you, Silva was 47 years old when he fought Paul. It's not going to be a surprise when the internet sensation takes Diaz down. So I'm hoping the Stockton native isn't holding his breath on a trilogy fight with Conor McGregor, because the Irishman isn't going to fight him if he loses to Jake Paul. Nate and Conor have had beef for the better half of their careers, and they've met in the cage twice, with both fighters bagging a win for themselves. So, you know the score isn't settled, and Diaz has been looking forward to a third meeting. Well, here's the thing. Diaz will lose everything when he loses to Paul, because there's nothing more embarrassing than being a UFC legend and losing to a YouTuber turned boxer. If you want to end your career, that's the way to do it. But not if you want more fights in the future. The fight world doesn't take Paul seriously since he's yet to come out on top against a pro, and for this very reason, losing to him is a significant setback. McGregor's one of the biggest names in the UFC, and he's finally ready to make a comeback after being out of the game for nearly 2 years due to a leg injury. The Irishman's got big plans for his comeback. He's going to start with locking horns with Michael Chandler, and then make a run for the welterweight title. That means fights with big guys such as Kamaru Usman and Leon Edwards. So a fight with Diaz, who lost to Jake Paul, isn't going to be the one he goes for, since it's going to be clear that he's not a top contender in MMA. You know, because the big guys don't lose to YouTubers? This is exactly why he should retire. Plus, it's not like he's going to have a lot of options either. Think about it. Diaz has accomplished everything he could in the UFC. So there's nothing left for him. The Stockton Slugger has ruled the hearts of many fight fans around the globe with his unfazed personality and ferocious fighting style. There's no denying that he's had one hell of a career and left quite a legacy behind. Now, the fact that he's ready to tarnish it all for a grudge fight is another thing, but it doesn't take away from the fact Nate has carried on his older brother, Nick Diaz's legacy with grace. Get this, Nate's got everything, so the smart thing to do would be to retire. He's made records, won impressive fights, Knock down big names, what else does this guy want? Now I know what you're probably thinking, but he's never been a champion, and that's the ultimate goal, right? The closest he ever got to becoming a UFC champion was when he locked horns with Benson Henderson, but he couldn't come through. Now the hunger to become champion is enough for Diaz to stay in the game, but let's not forget that him donning a UFC belt isn't in the cards anymore. Diaz isn't the great fighter he once was, and there are so many better athletes on the UFC roster. Plus, Father Time is catching on to the Stockton native, so he doesn't have what it takes to make a run for the title anymore. Time and old age don't spare even the best of us. Diaz is 38 years old, which in fighting years means it's time to call it quits. Health is the most important thing for an MMA fighter, and no matter how much time you spend in the gym, you will get old. So Nate is going to be slower, more sluggish, and will gas out quickly every time he steps into the cage or the ring. Plus, let's not forget that his injuries won't heal the way that they used to, and will have more impact. Fighters retire when they're close to 40 for the sake of their health, and Diaz needs to follow in their footsteps. For someone who's been fighting for almost 2 decades now, retirement is a good option, and even Diaz knows that. But his love for the sport is making him reel back in every time he decides to call it quits. But here's the thing, even fans are losing interest in watching the athlete step into the cage, and his name's going down in the dirt. That's all thanks to his endless controversies. Diaz has a thing for ending up on the wrong side of the law, street brawls and all. So the fight world isn't really up for it all because they want to see real fights, not Diaz knocking down Logan Paul lookalikes in the streets of New Orleans. Even Jake Paul versus Nate Diaz had mixed reactions because fans are not finding the buzz in this matchup. One took to social media and wrote, "Jake Paul versus Nate Diaz is such a joke." It's not that they're not big names, but it's the fact that a retired 155er is fighting a juiced TikToker at 185 who lost to a recreational boxer. It's not sitting right with fans who've had enough Nate fights. They want new names now, but hey, at least both athletes are going to walk home with big bucks. Which brings me to another reason why Nate should retire once he loses to Paul. He will have enough money to last him a lifetime after this fight, so there won't be any hunger to fight for money anymore. The UFC pays nothing compared to influencer boxing bouts, so Diaz is getting ready for one of the biggest paydays of his career, and I'm talking millions of dollars at the very least. That's a lot of money and will have him set for life. So retiring would be the smart thing to do, right? Well, there you have it, Fight World. From making big bucks that'll last him a lifetime, to possibly ruining his legacy by losing to a YouTuber, this was why Nate Diaz needs to retire if he loses to Jake Paul.